Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Rosemary Hebner, and I will be your moderator for today's session. Before we begin, I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items. First, a copy of today's slide deck and additional materials are available in the Handouts tab on your screen. If you have any questions during the broadcast, please submit them through the Q&A tab on your screen, and we will answer them at the end of our presentation. If we run out of time, we will answer any unanswered questions via follow-up email. For the best audio quality, be sure to turn up your volume. If you are experiencing any problems, refreshing your screen should help. An on-demand version of this webinar will be available 1 to 2 hours after we wrap up. You will receive an email notifying you that the recording is available, or you can also access it using the same link you received in your email when you registered. So now to introduce our presenters for today's session. Jack Sheldon is a senior remediation specialist at Antea Group with over 40 years of experience in the fields of environmental microbiology and remediation. Scott Recker is the environmental remediation practice leader at Antea Group with over 38 years of experience solving environmental business problems. Lastly, I'm a senior consultant, client account leader, and attorney with more than a decade of experience in environmental issues and regulations, and I previously worked as an environmental litigator before moving into consultancy at Antea Group. Before I turn it over to Scott and Jack, this slide highlights the contrast between the questions you need to ask yourself on the left versus what the C-suite is asking you in trying to extinguish liability. Ultimately, it boils down to whether or not you have a plan to exit liability. Ultimately, what does done look like? I'll turn it over to Jack.
Thanks, Ro, and thanks to all of you for joining us here today. I'm going to start out with perhaps the foundational tool for you to use to extinguish your remediation liability, and that would be the CSM, or conceptual site model. Now, a conceptual site model is garbage in, garbage out. You need to make the investment up front to build out a robust conceptual site model that you in turn can use to not only make decisions, but manage risk and also communicate to key stakeholders. Without a solid conceptual site model, you are at risk of not succeeding in meeting that goal of extinguishing your remediation liability. So how confident are you in your conceptual site model? 10%, 50%, 90%. Well, you surely want to get to those higher percentages, and the way you do that is with quality information. A second question you want to ask yourself is, are you using all the tools and technology that exists out there to build your conceptual site model? And that includes historic information that you have invested in previously. All that information and any new information that you generate is important to making that conceptual site model as robust as possible. And the tools keep getting better and better. There are so many on-site tools, high-resolution site characterization, drone imagery, geophysical techniques. The list goes on and on. There are new screening technologies, and there are new visualization software that exists out there, and every year that gets better and better. So what you see on the screen is an example of one look from a 3D visualization of a conceptual site model. And a conceptual site model, let's face it, has to tell the story of your site start to finish. So are you using all the latest tools and making good quality investment to make that model as good as you can get it? And then finally, does that conceptual site model align with your reserve setting? What's the expectation of your finance and executive leadership? Are you all aligned in terms of the strategic approach to the site? And does the conceptual site model align with your financial outlook for a site or portfolio of sites? Scott Rucker is going to delve into the business aspect of this, and I'll return a bit later to talk about some more details of the conceptual site model. Scott?
Thank you, Jack. Appreciate it. And welcome everybody this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are. So there are certainly some key considerations around remediation and the business elements of a remediation program. But the most important thing that you can do is develop an exit strategy. What, as Rosemary said, what does done look like? What does the end look like? So these are just considerations. These 4 elements are considerations that you need to take into account to develop that exit strategy. There's a lot of unknown risks for many of the sites that we often work with. There's unknown third-party risks, there's offsite concerns, there's stakeholder issues. All of those need to be taken into account to develop that exit strategy. Sometimes these are big numbers, and finance is very interested in where things are going, and the C-suite or the executive team can be very interested in where things are going. So understanding the numbers can be big, and you need to treat this with the respect that it deserves. These sites are complicated. They can have many twists and turns, and a lot of uncertainty can surround them. There are questions that you might not be able to answer when asked. So how do you deal with the uncertainty? And to a very important thing, how do you monetize that uncertainty? How do you address that from a monetary standpoint? And lastly, what's your organizational management philosophy around reserve setting and around risk tolerance? You see those 3 bullets at the bottom. There's 3 basic ways to approach legacy liability and extinguishing that. But how important is cash flow to your organization? Do you want to spend a minimum amount of cash each calendar period? Or do you want to go to that last bullet? Do you want to aggressively extinguish that liability and front load that spend to be able to knock the tail off of your spend in the out years of something? Or do you just want to be opportunistic like that middle bullet and look for chances or situations where you can spend money and create value for yourself in terms of extinguishing the liability? So these are really 7 steps that we talk about and discuss with many of our clients, and we've applied these tools in many situations. But and these don't have to be in any particular order, right? But it's what's your business outcome that you want to achieve? Are you selling a property and you only have to hold the liability for a short period of time? Are you going to operate on this property for the next 25 years? So your spend philosophy might be a little bit different. So understanding the business goals for the business and the finance goals, very important. What's the team that you need to progress the site? How do I need legal? How do I need finance? What kind of subject matter expertise or consultants do I need? Who are the stakeholders that are engaged here, and how do I leverage them? So building that team. Jack's talked about developing a conceptual site model. He'll talk about that a little bit more, but that is a true communication tool that you can use to drive things to an exit strategy. What's the regulatory framework? How do you negotiate within that regulatory framework? And then how do you leverage that to engage with stakeholders and strengthen those stakeholder relationships to ensure you have things aligned and you don't have someone somewhere along the line saying, no, we can't do that for whatever reason. So that stakeholder engagement is huge. And then once you put all that together, you can develop that exit strategy, show that from a milestone perspective, from a progression perspective. And that last step, again, What the business folks are interested in and what your finance is interested in is, how do I monetize that exit strategy, taking into account some of the uncertainties that you may have. So I'm going to let Jack dive a little bit deeper into the conceptual site model and the investments that can pay off for you.
Thanks, Scott. So going back to the conceptual site model once again, it is a robust tool and it's dynamic. It's something you use throughout the lifetime of your project. And the more information you add to it, the better it gets. It literally becomes your decision-making tool, your risk management tool, your communication tool. And back in the day, many of you were around when a conceptual site model was a few paragraphs on a piece of paper, a photo, a site plan, and a table of data. Well, how far we've come nowadays. Look at the 3D visualization outputs that you see to the right of the slides there, and all the different inputs that go into a conceptual site model. We can do a whole lot more than just show a site's geology or the movement of groundwater. We can do a whole lot more than add analytical data to a conceptual site model. We can look at individual reactive zones where microbes are active. We can look at geochemistry. We can weave in sensitive receptors. We can look at background information and build that into the conceptual site model. So these conceptual site models become the story of the site. And the better the data that goes in, again, I said garbage in, garbage out. The better the data, the better the story you're going to be able to tell, the more successful an outcome you're going to have. And as Scott mentioned, and I mentioned it earlier, your conceptual site model is your communication tool. And sometimes we forget about all the different people we need to communicate to, not only regulators, but other third parties, perhaps the public, real estate people, legal, technical folks, not only your consultants, but also subcontractors and others that might come onto the site. And then, of course, regulators. The conceptual site model is the tool to get everyone on the same page. And when you do that, when you achieve that, you really can drive a project along and really get to a true point of extinguishing remediation liability, whether that's for one site or an entire portfolio of sites. So this is your communication tool. May look like funny pictures or bright colors, but in each one of these conceptual site models is a story. And the one you see there on your screen is a very complex bedrock site with all the different fractures that are portrayed. Yet this is a tool that simply can tell the story to a variety of different stakeholders. And of course, there are multiple pathways to closure on any given site. It's very rare that you have just one pathway or strategic approach. You may have various approaches that you need to consider with your consultant, but always be ready to change course. And a quick example of that is a regulatory change. I know I've seen in many states recently, they've lowered the standards for certain types of groundwater constituents. So you may have been charging along on a particular pathway, and now you have to shift gears because you have different regulatory standards to deal with. So that bottom graphic here is really the key. Spending up front can help you better define the problem and pay dividends in the future. So don't skimp on a conceptual site model. It is your ticket to ultimate success and extinguishing your liability. I'm going to pass to Scott for the very important topic of monetization.
Thank you, Jack. So we all live in a world where it's a lot about the money. It's always about the money. And you're feeling pressures from your finance folks, from your legal, from the CFO about how to reserve, how to monetize, always questions. The auditors are asking you questions about that. So being able to speak in the language of business when you're dealing with this remediation liability creates confidence in you with those, especially those finance folks, and allows you to move things forward using tools like the conceptual site model that Jack described. But there's a lot of uncertainty with what we do. What are the universe of risks that we have. What's the regulatory situation? How does that change? Is what we're doing cost effective? Is it different? Is it new? How long is this going to take? I've got 7 options on the table. Which one is the best most cost-effective option? What's the cost of each? What if I just don't do anything? What's going to happen to me from a reputation standpoint, from a brand standpoint? So these are all considerations, and there's many more that we wrestle with every day. So how do we take all of these considerations into play and then monetize these sites so we can set the reserves and have a meaningful discussion with our finance folks so they can do their job? We can inform them. A couple of the definitions around the reporting requirements at the federal level in the U.S. These financial obligations need to be reported for public entities. And we talk about probable and estimable. Those are keywords. And reasonably estimated, keywords. The requirement under FASB and under ASTM is that you must report those probable and estimable elements of your project, but you don't necessarily have to report as a liability on your balance sheet something that is reasonably estimated or could potentially occur, but is not probable at this point or this part of the project life cycle. So those are very important distinctions to make, and organizations sometimes get hung up on the distinction between those two things. There is a difference between the reserve that you are required to report versus what the total liability for a site might be. So if you are in an early life cycle on a complex project and you're just assessing it and you're building your conceptual site model, as Jack alluded to, you're not going to know what the ultimate outcome of that project is going to be. And because there's so much uncertainty there, you are not required to reserve for that total legacy liability, that total life cycle, because you can't estimate it at this point. Something that's key to keep in mind. That reserve does not have to equal the total liability, and it rarely does equal the total liability. There is no right and wrong way to do reserves and what to include and what not to include. What's important is that you apply whatever process or philosophy that you have consistently across your organization. So if you decide we want to burden the balance sheet with just the minimum that we can, you can define that within your organization. What does that minimum look like? Only those probable and estimable tasks or elements of a project, and you do not have to reserve beyond that. That's certainly not going to equal the total liability of your project or your portfolio. But as long as you are doing things consistently and with continuity across the organization with your finance folks, you will be in great shape when it comes to being audited, to being looked at by financial regulators. Again, thinking about the cost estimate, the universe of how do you estimate this liability? It's a range, and it gets more complex as you move up, and it takes into account more uncertainty as you move up. So you can take we cannot estimate this at all. That's certainly an option. There's a known minimum value, right? This project is going to go for 7 years at this estimated cost per year, and that's a deterministic number. That's a number. Then you start to get into evaluating or considering some of the uncertainties, right? What if the project goes this particular way with this particular set of outcomes? That single point cost estimate is going to be X for the total life cycle cost. And then if you want to take into account uncertainties, or what I like to call what ifs, what if this occurs, then this outcome happens, and vice versa, you can take those into account with a dynamic approach, with a probabilistic approach. And that gives your finance folks, but especially your business folks, a view of what's the total expected liability for this issue. You may not want to reserve up to that number, but you can inform the business about that. Having these types of conversations with your business folks, with your finance folks, very, very important. And they recognize that you're speaking their language, and it will make your life easier in the long run. So here we just wanted to show an example, and this is a real example of a portfolio that a client is working with, right? So this year in 2025, they expect to spend 14.4 million. You can see that on the right side of your screen in the table. They are going to get back through either insurance or other reimbursement state fund programs. They're going to get back almost 4 million. So they're going to spend about 10.5 million this year on 323 sites. What we're projecting, looking out into the future, using a combination of deterministic models and some probabilistic models to evaluate uncertainty on complex sites. If we drive this portfolio out 10 years from now, their spend's going to be down to less than $1 million, $500,000, 480,000, only on 24 sites. That's the kind of information that your finance people and your business people absolutely are in love with. So I'm going to turn things back over to Ro to wrap us up, and then we can get into our questions.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Jack, for sharing your expertise and insights. At this time, we're ready to address questions from our audience. As a reminder, you can still submit your questions via the question and answer tool on the screen up until the close of our broadcast today. Our first question from the audience: how do I communicate to my finance team when I cannot give them a clean answer on my total liability due to the uncertainty of this project? Scott, this sounds like one for you.
So if I were to get a question like that, I'd actually be happy because it's an opportunity. So if there's so much uncertainty on your project that you simply cannot estimate it, that is the perfect time to reveal your conceptual site model in a relatively simple form to your finance team and explain, this is what's going on. These are the variables that I need to consider. And if you've already established a reserve philosophy or process, then you can explain how it fits into that and why you can't estimate the entire life cycle cost. If you get pushed by your finance to say, I don't care, I need a number, then you've got to go back to that base philosophy. Do you have a consistent process in place with your finance folks to do your reserve or to do your business estimates? If the answer is yes, you just follow that process. If the answer is no, or there's still some gray zones in there, then again, that's an opportunity to sit down with the finance folks and even legal and refine that. So I know that's not a clean answer, but it's really an opportunity to make sure that you've got the right business philosophy and processes in place, and that you're always going back to those or refining those as you go.
Excellent. Thank you, Scott. Our second question from the audience: can a conceptual site model be used to show how my site conditions have changed over time? Jack, let's kick this one over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ro, and thanks for the question. Yeah, if you choose the right software to build out your conceptual site model, you can get a tremendous amount of output from it. You can get everything from calculating soil volumes to looking at how much groundwater is affected. You can calculate mass and mass reductions. There's nothing better than to see the mass come plummeting down over a period of time, but you can also do a time sequence. If you take your historic investment, the data that you've generated over the years, and build that into the model, you can actually input that and then watch it as you time sequence and watch your plume shrink. And that is a beautiful sight for those that are pushing their way to extinguish their liability. It's really a sight to behold. So,
and as an example of that, I mean, we've had that experience, but I remember a very specific situation where we got a new it wasn't a new project, it was new for us. We built our conceptual site model and we sat down with the business leader that had been dealing with the issue for 15 years. And he said, I understand this better in 15 minutes than I have for the past 15 years. And it was just about taking that visualization and showing that to him and how that changed over time. That's a great question.
I think a conceptual site model can show you things that you would never envisioned you could see in a site before. And that's the real beauty of it, right? You want to be able to see all the angles so that you can manage your way through the strategy.
Excellent. Thank you both, Scott and Jack, for your responses. That wraps our question and answer portion. And again, thank you, Jack and Scott, for sharing your time, your wisdom, and your expertise with us today. As a reminder, audience, you can download a copy of today's slides and additional materials from the Q&A tab on your screen. Today's session will be available within 1 to 2 hours after we wrap, and you will receive an email with a link to access the recording. Lastly, there's also a survey that will pop up after we close the webinar broadcast. We'd really appreciate that you complete the short survey and give us feedback so that we can better serve your needs moving forward. Thank you all again for joining us, and we hope you found this information useful. Stay healthy and stay safe and have a great rest of your day.